The gun was already in Andrew Ralston's hand when Alma Hart looked him dead in the eye and said the words that would split his chest open wider than any bullet ever could. "You never wanted me here. Admit it. I was a mistake from the first day you laid eyes on me, and every problem that has followed has been because you could not bring yourself to turn me away when you should have." The saloon was dead quiet. Every man in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, had gone still: the card players, the barkeep, the drunk who slept against the far wall most nights. Outside, the wind pressed against the shuttered windows like it was trying to get in and hear the answer too. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town smelled of dust and desperation, both of which had been building for months. Andrew did not lower the gun. He could not, because the man it was aimed at, a broad-shouldered, flat-eyed predator named Cole Daggett, still had his own hand hovering near his holster, and a moment's hesitation would mean the end of more than this conversation. But his eyes moved to Alma, and what she saw in them was not the cold indifference she had expected. What she saw cracked something open behind her ribs that she was not prepared for. "Alma," he said, his voice lower than a prayer, rougher than the canyon walls east of town, "if you believe that, then everything I have done since the night I found you on that road has been a failure." She had not expected those words. She had expected nothing, or anger, or the silence men like Andrew Ralston used like a weapon when the truth became inconvenient. She had not expected that the admission would cost him something. She could see it did, see the muscle in his jaw working hard, see the way his free hand pressed flat against his thigh like he was steadying himself against the weight of saying it out loud. Cole Daggett chose that moment to lunge. The shot came fast, clean, deliberate. The room exploded back into noise. Alma pressed herself against the bar, heart hammering, and watched Andrew Ralston handle a crisis the way he handled everything, with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who had been forced to become capable long before he was ready. Cole went down clutching his shoulder, his pistol skittering across the floorboards. He was alive. Andrew had made sure of that, which told Alma something she had not allowed herself to know about him until now. He made sure men like Cole Daggett could stand trial. Andrew crossed the room in 4 steps, kicked the fallen pistol under the bar, and crouched to bind Cole's wrist with a strip of leather from his coat pocket. A strip he had ready, she realized, because he had walked in here tonight already knowing how it would end. Already knowing and still having time to feel the blade of her accusation. He looked up at her from the floor, still crouched, one hand pressing the leather tight around Daggett's wrist. His brown eyes were the color of creek water in the late afternoon, and they held something that had been there for a very long time. She suddenly understood. Something she had been too frightened and too stubborn to name. "You were not in my plans for this life," he said quietly, the saloon so still that every man in it heard the words anyway. "And I am grateful everyday plans change." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alma Hart had ever heard. She had arrived in Redemption Creek 7 months earlier, in March of 1882, when the last snow was still sitting in the shadows of the Red Rock Canyon walls, and the wind came off the high desert with a kind of intention, like it had decided personally to make life difficult. She had come on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, a battered leather trunk beneath her feet, a carpetbag on her lap, and a letter in her coat pocket from a man she had never met. A rancher named Horace Webb who had advertised in the Albuquerque Weekly Journal for a housekeeper with experience managing a large property. Alma had experience, all right. She had managed her father's house in Missouri from the time she was 13, after her mother passed from typhoid. And then she had managed the household of her late husband, Gerald Hart, for 4 years until the consumption took him, leaving her with nothing except debts she had not known he was accumulating, and a stubborn refusal to ask her family in St. Louis for help she did not intend to pay back. She was 26 years old, widowed, practically penniless, and deeply private about all of it. She was not beautiful in the way fashion plates were beautiful, but she had a face that was specific and interesting: high cheekbones, gray eyes that were almost silver in bright light, dark hair she kept pinned tightly because everything about her situation suggested that looseness of any kind was a luxury she could not afford. She was precise, competent, and almost entirely self-contained, which meant that she arrived at things other people arrived at much later, having taken longer to trust what she felt. The stage had a broken wheel fitting repaired in Redemption Creek, and they pulled in at 11 in the morning on a March Tuesday with the town looking exactly like what it was. A small, hard-working supply town that served 3 surrounding ranches and a handful of farms, anchored by the general store, the saloon, a doctor's office, a livery, and a telegraph office that also served as the post. There was a Methodist church on the north end that doubled as the schoolhouse on weekdays and had a bell that was broken, and so only rang when someone climbed up and struck it by hand, which people did with more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary. Alma had climbed out of the stage to stretch her legs while the wheel fitting was seen to, and she had walked to the general store to ask after directions to the Webb Ranch. The woman behind the counter, a broad and energetic person named Mrs. Dolores Fuentes, who appeared to be simultaneously running the store, feeding a baby, and keeping track of 3 children elsewhere in the building by the sound of their voices, had looked at Alma with frank assessment. "You are going to work for Horace Webb," Dolores had said. "I have a position as housekeeper," Alma said. Dolores' expression did something complicated. "Webb's ranch is 8 miles east. You will need someone to drive you when your stage goes on. Where are you from, if you do not mind?" "Missouri, most recently," Alma said, which was true and omitted most of the relevant details. "Have you met Webb? We corresponded by letter." Dolores placed both hands flat on the counter and leveled Alma with a look that was simultaneously kind and extremely serious. "His last housekeeper stayed 6 weeks. The one before lasted 2 months. He is not a violent man, but he is extremely difficult, and he will not respect your authority over the household unless you make him, and that will take more energy than most women find worth spending." Alma had thought of her depleted savings, the $3.40 folded into her coat lining, and the complete absence of alternatives. "I appreciate the warning," she had said. That was where Andrew Ralston had come in, not dramatically, not memorably, and not at all in the way things would later develop between them, which was part of what made it so improbable. He had been at the counter beside her, waiting to collect a supply order, and he had heard the entire exchange with the expression of a man who was only partially listening, because he had heard variations of this conversation before. He was tall, lean in the way men who worked cattle were lean, not thin but condensed, all of it functional, with dark hair growing a little too long at the collar, and a jaw that had not been shaved in 3 days. He wore a work coat that had been good quality once and was still serviceable, and his boots were worn but well maintained. He had the hands of someone who worked hard with them and the eyes of someone who paid attention to things other people missed. He had not introduced himself. He had simply said, while picking up his wrapped parcels from Dolores, "I am driving out past the Webb place today. If you need a ride, the wagon leaves at noon." Alma had looked at him and performed the rapid calculations that women in her position were always performing: threat assessment, reliability estimate, the cost of refusal versus the cost of acceptance. He met her eyes directly, which could mean several things, and he did not appear to need her to accept or decline, which was its own kind of information. He was already turning to carry his parcels out. "Thank you," she had said to his back. He had nodded without turning around. That was how it began. With a wagon ride on a cold March morning, 8 miles of hard-packed, rode through country that was stark and enormous and brutally beautiful, and a man who spoke approximately 4 sentences the entire journey, and all of them functional. His name was Andrew Ralston. He was 31 years old, and he owned the largest operating ranch in the county, a 40,000-acre property called Dry Creek Ranch that his father had started, and he had spent 9 years making into something that could last. He employed 12 permanent hands, ran cattle and some sheep, had been developing a breeding program for horses that was starting to generate real interest, and had a reputation in Redemption Creek for being fair, private, and absolutely uninterested in anything that did not directly pertain to the work. He was not cold. That was the thing Alma would come to understand slowly, and understand wrong several times before she understood it correctly. He was not cold, he was careful. There was a distinction that mattered more than she initially gave it credit for. She spent her first 2 weeks at the Webb Ranch, confirming everything Dollars had told her, and discovering several things Dollars had not mentioned, specifically that Horace Webb had a habit of making decisions that were entirely someone else's problem to implement, a stubborn conviction that accounts did not need to be kept with any regularity because he would remember what he had spent, and a tendency to invite people to dinner without informing the kitchen in advance. He was not actively unkind. He was just exhausting, in the way that people who have never had to be responsible for their own comfort are always exhausting to those who are responsible for theirs. Alma managed him with the same precision she applied to everything. She established the household accounts within the first week, presented him with a ledger he was required to consult before authorizing expenditures, and informed the 2 other household staff, a Mexican woman named Rosa who cooked, and an older man named Pete who did the heavy work, that their positions and wages were now recorded in writing and would be honored. She did all of this quietly and without making it a confrontation, because confrontation was never the most efficient path. What she did not manage was the anxiety that came with her at night, when the wind hit the ranch house walls and the lamp burned low, and the silence was complete and enormous in a way Missouri silence had never been. She had been alone before, but frontier alone was different. It was a solitude with teeth. She did not see Andrew Ralston for the first 3 weeks, and then she saw him too much, which was its own kind of problem. The Webb Ranch and Dry Creek Ranch shared a border at the eastern property line, and Andrew had some kind of business agreement with Webb that brought him by roughly once a week. The first time he came after her arrival, he came around to the back of the house where Alma was working through the kitchen garden beds, attempting to establish which of the previous year's plantings had survived and which needed to be replaced. He stopped at the garden fence, looked at what she was doing and said, "The rosemary will come back. The lavender on the south side will not." She looked up from the kneeling position she was in, covered in March dirt, deeply unglamorous. "How can you tell?" "Root damage from last winter's freeze. The stems are hollow when you cut them." He demonstrated on the nearest lavender plant with a small knife he produced from his coat pocket, showing her the pale, dry interior. "The rosemary has got deeper roots." It was a practical piece of information offered without any intent she could identify, and she thanked him for it, and he nodded once and went around to the front of the house to find Webb. But he had done that, stopped, noticed what she was doing, offered what he knew, not to impress her, just because it was useful and he had it to give. This happened several times over the following weeks. It was never a conversation exactly, more like the exchange of information between 2 people who were both paying attention. He noticed things she was working on. She noticed things about the way he worked. He did not make small talk. She appreciated that more than she wanted to admit, because small talk required an energy she was perpetually short of, and with him she never felt the pressure of it. What she did feel was something she was not immediately able to name, because she had been so thoroughly occupied with survival that she had let certain capacities for feeling go somewhat dormant. The way a garden goes dormant in winter, not because the roots are dead, but because there is not yet enough warmth to make it safe to grow. The trouble came in May, and it came in the form of Cole Daggett. Cole was from Arizona Territory originally, though no one in Redemption Creek knew the details and he did not offer them. He arrived in late April with 2 men who kept to themselves, and a manner that presented as easygoing friendliness, and was actually something else entirely, something Alma clocked on his second visit to the Webb Ranch as a kind of patient, calculating watchfulness. He was working with a small outfit that grazed land to the south, or said he was, and he was friendly enough with Horace Webb that Webb invited him to dinner twice. Alma had learned to trust her instincts about people even when she could not articulate exactly what they were telling her. Gerald, her late husband, had been charming in a way that had initially read as warmth and had revealed itself gradually as a performance with specific goals beneath it. Cole Daggett had a similar quality. The friendliness was real enough, but it was also operational, which meant it served a purpose, which meant there was a purpose to serve. She kept her distance. She was polite when she had to be and invisible when she could manage it. Cole noticed that she was keeping her distance, which told him she was paying attention, which appeared to interest him in a way that made the back of her neck prickle. In late May, she told Andrew about it. She had not planned to. She had walked to the eastern fence line with a message from Webb for Andrew about a disputed water right, delivered the message, and was turning to go back when she said, before she had consciously decided to say anything, "Do you know Cole Daggett?" Andrew was mending a section of fence and he did not stop working, but she had the sense that his attention shifted entirely toward her. "By reputation," he said. "What reputation?" A pause, the kind he used when he was deciding how much of what he knew was relevant to what he was being asked. "Trouble follows him," he said. "Nothing ever sticks to him personally, but trouble follows." She nodded slowly. "That matches what I see." He set down the fence tool and looked at her directly in the way he did when something mattered. "Has he done something?" "Nothing I could name in front of a judge," she said carefully. "He looks at me in a way I do not enjoy. He asks questions about the property, and he remembers every answer, which most people with innocent interest do not bother to do." Andrew was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Stay closer to the house. If he comes to dinner again, have Pete nearby." "That is what I intended," she said. "Good." She went back to the house. She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day and could not entirely account for why it had made her feel so much less alone. What she did not know, and would not discover for another 2 months, was that Cole Daggett was there because of a land scheme that involved Webb's property, Andrew's property, and a man in Santa Fe with money and no scruples, and that the whole thing had been quietly building since before Alma arrived. Andrew knew about it, had known about it since February, which was why he had eyes on the Webb place as often as he did. He had not told Alma because he did not yet know how much she knew or what her connection to it was, which was the wrong calculation, and he would pay for it later. June brought heat and Alma's first real conversation with Dolores Fuentes that lasted more than 5 minutes. She had started coming into town with the weekly supply run, and Dolores appeared to have made a decision that Alma Hart was worth knowing, which she demonstrated by talking to her with complete frankness about everything from the local water politics to the particular challenges of raising children in a place where the doctor was 50 miles away on a bad road. "You should come to the church social," Dolores said one Thursday. "It is not particularly spiritual, but the food is good, and people here need to know you exist separately from Horace Webb's household. It is important in a small town to be a person in your own right." Alma had not gone to social events since Gerald died. It had not felt safe, exactly, being among people who would ask questions she did not want to answer about what came next, what she planned, whether she had family. But Dolores had a way of making the obvious seem like something that had not occurred to you yet, which was a very useful social skill, and Alma found herself agreeing. The church social was on the last Saturday in June. Andrew was there, which she had not particularly expected, though she should have. He was embedded in this community in ways she was still learning to trace. He was talking to the sheriff, a lean gray-haired man named Elias Marsh, when she arrived, and he noticed her come in with the quiet, efficient noticing that she had come to recognize as specific to him. He crossed the room about 20 minutes later. Not directly, not immediately, not in a way that announced itself. Just eventually, he was standing near her, with a plate of food he was not eating, and then they were talking, and she could not have said exactly who had started it. She learned things she had not known. He had grown up in Texas, come to New Mexico territory with his father in 1869 when he was 18, and stayed after his father died in 1873. He had a younger sister in El Paso who wrote occasionally. He had not been back to Texas in 4 years because there was always something that needed doing here. He said this without self-pity, as a plain statement of fact, which was how he said most things. She told him she was from Missouri. She told him about her father's farm, the household management, the competence that felt like inheritance because it had been acquired so early. She did not tell him about Gerald yet. But she told him more than she had intended, because talking to Andrew Ralston was in some ways like talking to herself. There was no performance required, no management of his impression of her, just the exchange of true things at whatever pace felt honest. It was at the church social that she noticed something else, something that tightened the knot in her chest that had been there since May. Cole Daggett was there too, and he was watching her and Andrew talk with an expression of focused interest that had nothing pleasant in it. She told Andrew about the expression quietly as they stood near the edge of the room. He did not look at Cole. He said, "I know. I have been watching him." "You have been watching him here too?" A pause. "Longer than here." She looked at his profile. "Andrew, what do you know that you have not told me?" Another pause, this one longer and weighted differently. "I did not know how much you knew," he said finally, "or what you were connected to." The betrayal of that, not sharp, not dramatic, but real, like a bruise discovered by accident, settled somewhere in her. She had not yet articulated to herself how much she had begun to trust him, which meant she had not yet understood how much this particular withholding cost her. "I am connected to nothing except a job that pays me $18 a month and covers my room and board," she said quietly. "That is the entire extent of my connection." He turned to look at her then, and she saw what the assessment of her had cost him, because it was written plainly on his face if you knew how to read it. He was not a demonstrative man, but he was an honest one, which sometimes made him harder to read, and sometimes made him the clearest thing in the room. "Then I owe you an explanation," he said. "Not here. Tomorrow, if you can get to the eastern fence line by mid-morning." She had gone. She always went when Andrew asked her to, which was something she thought about much later, when she could be honest about the sequence of things. He told her the full story at the fence line the next morning, leaning against the top rail with the early heat already rising off the rocks to the east, and his hat pushed back on his head in a way she had not seen before. He told her that Cole Daggett worked for a land speculator named Morton Graves in Santa Fe, that Graves had been quietly buying up debt on properties in this area for 2 years, that Webb's ranch was over-leveraged, and Graves intended to call the notes, that the Webb property, once acquired, would give Graves access to the water rights Andrew's ranch depended on, and that the whole scheme would strangle Dry Creek Ranch within 3 years unless the notes could be bought out or contested. "Why did you not tell me?" she said. "I live on that property. I had a right to know." "You did," he said. "I am sorry." Those 2 words from Andrew Ralston, she would come to know, cost more than from most people. He did not use them as social lubricant. He used them when he meant them. "I thought you might be working for him," he said. "The timing of your arrival, a new housekeeper just when he needed someone in the house to assess the property. I thought—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "You thought I was a spy," she said. "For about a week," he said. "After that, no." "What changed?" He looked at her sideways. "You are terrible at being a spy. You notice everything, you remember everything, and you cannot keep from making things better when you could leave them alone. If Daggett had sent you, you would have long since organized his filing system." It was the most words he had said about her to her face, and it was so precisely accurate that she laughed, a short, surprised laugh that felt like something loosening in her chest that had been tight for a long time. He smiled at that, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, the kind that involved his eyes, and she had to look away because it did something to her equilibrium. She was not prepared to manage at a fence line at 10 in the morning in front of God and the New Mexico sky. "What are you planning to do about graves?" she asked. "I have a lawyer in Santa Fe working on the debt. If we can prove the original notes were issued under fraudulent terms, which I believe they were, the whole structure collapses. But it takes time, and Daggett is here to make sure it does not work." "How?" "Pressure, confusion. He is going to try to make Webb sign something he should not sign, or make me make a mistake that can be used against me. He has done it before in Arizona." "What happened in Arizona?" Andrew was quiet for a moment. "A family lost their ranch. The father died of a heart episode 6 months after. I do not think the two things were unrelated." She turned that over. "So you have been watching this happen to someone before?" "Yes." "And you could not stop it then?" No. She understood then the full weight of what this was for him. Not just a legal dispute or a financial threat, a reckoning with something he had already failed to prevent once. A second chance that he was determined not to waste. "Then tell me what I can do," she said. "I have full access to Webb's household accounts. If there are documents there that would help your lawyer, I can find them." He looked at her steadily. "That is not nothing." "No," she said, "it is not." They worked together after that, quietly and systematically, the way two people who are fundamentally aligned work when they finally find each other. Alma went through Webb's accounts with the patience and precision she had brought to everything since she was 13 years old, and she found things: correspondence with a Santa Fe bank, notes on terms she brought to Andrew, who forwarded them to his lawyer. She was not breaching anyone's confidence because Webb had given her full authority over the household accounts, which meant the accounts were hers to understand. What she did not expect was that working alongside Andrew, even at a distance, even through the intermediary of information passed at a fence line, would feel like the most natural arrangement she had encountered in her adult life. She started to know his patterns. When he was at the eastern fence, he had usually been working since before dawn. He brought coffee in a battered tin canister and shared it without asking if she wanted any, just poured a second cup, which was a small thing that made her deeply happy in a way she could not entirely defend. He was curious about her, not invasively, not in the way of someone assembling a picture for purposes, but genuinely curious about how she thought, about the precision of her observations, about the way she understood people and situations. He asked questions that were not small talk but were not quite personal either, occupying that specific middle ground where intelligence and genuine interest meet. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know something that you have been carefully not knowing for a while, suddenly, irrevocably, with a sensation of inevitability that is both welcome and frightening. She was falling in love with Andrew Ralston, who had suspected her of being a spy, who carried his feelings like a man carrying a very heavy box across a long field, who smiled rarely enough that when he did it felt like a change in the weather. She did not tell him. She was very good at not telling people things. What she could not control was that Cole Daggett had noticed what was developing between them, and that he recognized it as a potential leverage point in a situation where he was running low on good options, because Andrew's lawyer in Santa Fe was making genuine progress and Daggett knew it. In July, he made his move. Alma came to the eastern fence line one morning and found the ground churned up by several horses and one of Andrew's fence posts broken. The damage was recent, the wood was fresh splintered, and it said, in the language of frontier intimidation, that someone had wanted to make a statement. She went back to the house and sent Pete into town with a message for Andrew, and then she sat down and thought carefully about what the next move was. Andrew arrived at the Webb place mid-afternoon, which was fast. He examined the fence damage and the tracks and then came to find her in the kitchen garden where she was, with great appearance of calm, pulling weeds. "He is accelerating," Andrew said. "That means the legal work is working," she said. "Yes. So we keep going." Alma. He said her name in a particular way, the way people say a name when they need the person attached to it to stop and really hear what they are saying. "He will not stop at fences." She straightened up from the garden and looked at him directly. She had been thinking about this since this morning, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. I know that. Which means I need to know that you— He stopped, worked his jaw, started again. I need to know that you will tell me if something concerns you, not manage it yourself. Tell me. I thought you were not particularly inclined to information sharing, she said, and immediately regretted it because it came out sharper than she intended and she could see it land. He nodded slowly, accepting that. Fair enough, he said. That was a mistake on my part and I will not repeat it. All right, she said. Then we have the same agreement. He reached out and with extreme care removed a smear of garden dirt from her jaw with his thumb. It was over in a second, barely contact, nothing she could point to as anything definite, but her heart made a lurch behind her ribs that she felt in her hands. He did not comment on it. He turned to go and said over his shoulder, "Come to the ranch on Thursday. I want you to meet my foreman, Jim. He should know your face." In case of what? She said. In case of anything, he said. She went on Thursday. Dry Creek Ranch was 8 miles east of the Webb place, and it was, she thought when she saw it properly for the first time, exactly what she would have expected from Andrew Ralston if she had been asked to predict it. Not grand but solid, everything placed with intention, the buildings well maintained without being decorative, the yard organized around function rather than appearance. The horses in the paddock were the finest she had seen in this territory, which meant the breeding program was doing what he said it was. Jim Calloway, the foreman, was a compact, direct man in his 40s with weathered hands, and a manner that reminded her of a well-made tool. No excess, entirely reliable. He shook her hand rather than tipping his hat, which she appreciated. He looked at Andrew while doing it in a way that told her this assessment mattered to Jim quite a lot. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Hart," Jim said. "Mrs. Hart," she said, not unkindly, though the distinction has become more theoretical than practical. Jim's eyes moved to Andrew and back. "Of course," he said. Andrew showed her around the property, which he had not planned to do and which took most of the afternoon. She asked questions because the operation was genuinely interesting, and he answered them with increasing detail and enthusiasm, which was how she discovered that underneath the economy of expression was someone who loved this work, who had thought very carefully about every aspect of it, who got to the edge of animation when he talked about the horse breeding and then pulled back, as if animation were an indulgence he was not sure he had earned. She said, "You do not have to stop when you get interested." It is not unattractive. He blinked. It was the most visibly caught off guard she had ever seen him. What? The talking, when it becomes real, you do not have to pull back from it. She looked at the horses in the far paddock rather than at him. "It is one of the things about you that I find worth paying attention to." A silence that felt like it had weather in it. "Alma," he said. "We should probably get back," she said. "Webb will expect me for dinner." The next week, Cole Daggett made a more direct move. He cornered her near the back of the general store in town, between the flour barrels and the back shelving, in a way that made it look accidental if anyone glanced, and spoke to her in a low, pleasant voice about how unfortunate it would be if it came to light that she had been sharing Webb's private papers with a competitor, which was how he characterized what she and Andrew were doing. He used the word theft. He used the phrase criminal offense. He watched her face the whole time. She looked at him with complete steadiness and said, "Mr. Daggett, I manage Mr. Webb's accounts with his full authority." The sharing of relevant information with parties who have legitimate business interests in Mr. Webb's property is within that authority. If you would like to debate the legal framework further, I suggest you do so with the lawyer whose name you will find on the correspondence your employer has certainly already seen. She picked up the sack of flour she had come for. "Have a good afternoon." She walked out of the store with her heart slamming against her sternum and went directly to find Andrew. He was at the livery. She came in and told him everything, word for word, which was one of her genuine gifts, total recall when the situation required it. He listened without interrupting, and by the time she finished, the quality of his stillness had changed in a way that she had not seen before. It was very controlled, very focused, and underneath it was something that looked like rage. "You are not safe at the web place," he said. "I'm not sure I am safe anywhere. Daggett has decided to take an interest in me," she said, "which means running does not particularly help." "That is correct," he said, and looked at her for a long moment. "I have a room at the ranch, a proper room with a lock. Rose's cousin could take over at Webb's while you are," he stopped again, reorganizing. "I am asking you if you would come to Dry Creek until this is resolved." It was the most personal request he had made of her, and they both knew it. She thought about propriety and what it was worth in a situation where propriety was the tool being used to threaten her. She thought about the room with the lock and what it would mean to be 8 miles closer to someone she trusted. She thought about Andrew's face when he had called her name in that particular way, and what she had seen in it when he thought she was not fully looking. "Yes," she said, "I will come." She stayed at Dry Creek Ranch through July and into August, and it was the strangest and most complete period of her adult life. She found a role there that fit her without being assigned. She took over the household accounts as she had at Webb's, organized the supply ordering, worked with the cook, a man named Hector, on the kitchen garden that had been somewhat neglected. And in the evenings, when the heat lifted off the land and the sky went extraordinary colors above the canyon rim, she and Andrew sat on the porch and talked. They talked more than she had ever talked to anyone. Not constantly. There were long, comfortable silences that she had learned were not silences at all but a different kind of conversation, the kind where you were comfortable enough not to fill space with noise. But there were also long stretches of real talking, the kind where one thing leads to another, and you surface suddenly aware that hours have passed. She told him about Gerald. She had not planned to, but it came out one evening when he asked about Missouri with genuine curiosity, and she found herself describing the arc of it. The marriage at 20 that had seemed like a reasonable path, the 4 years of managing someone who could not manage himself, the strange mixture of grief and relief when he died, and the debts that came after that had felt like a punishment for the relief. Andrew was quiet through all of it, and when she finished he said, "That is a long time to be capable for someone who required it." She had to close her eyes briefly because that was an extremely precise description of something she had never managed to articulate to herself. "Yes," she said, "it was. You have been doing it your whole life," he said, "being capable for whoever required it. It is what I know how to do. I know." A pause. "You are also allowed to want things for yourself, Alma." She looked at him in the near dark, the lamp at the far end of the porch throwing just enough light to see his face. "I am aware of that. Are you?" She looked away at the canyon rim, where the last of the evening light was sitting. "I am working on it," she admitted. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but had something warm in it. "Good." She was almost completely in love with him by this point, with the total, undefended kind of love that arrives when you have been watching someone be exactly who they are for long enough that the watching becomes the ground you stand on. She loved the way he moved through problems, not around them, not dramatically over them, but through them, methodically and without self-pity. She loved the way he treated Jim and Hector and the ranch hands as the competent people they were, with directness and fairness and no performance of authority. She loved the way he made room for her without making a production of it. She loved the rare smiles and the economy of words and the moment every morning when he came in from the early chores, and she had coffee ready and they sat across the table from each other in the cool morning quiet, before everything began. She did not tell him any of this. She was still, even now, very good at not telling people things. In August, Andrew's lawyer in Santa Fe sent word that the case against the fraudulent notes was nearly complete, but that they needed one more piece, a specific letter that the lawyer believed existed in Webb's correspondence files, from a bank officer in Santa Fe to Graves that outlined the terms of the scheme explicitly. It was the difference between a strong case and an unanswerable one. Alma knew exactly where it would be, if it existed. She had organized those files. "I need to go back to the Webb place," she said, Andrew's face did a thing she had not seen it do before, which was resist expressing something and fail at it. "I will go with you. It will be faster if I go alone. I know the filing system. Alma. I will go in the morning when Daggett is unlikely to be there, get what I need, and come back by midday. You can meet me at the eastern fence." He was quiet for a very long time. She could see him working through the calculations, the risk, the efficiency, the particular difficulty of telling her no when she had already thought it through. "If you are not at the fence by noon," he said, "I am coming." She went the next morning. She found the letter exactly where she expected it, in a file marked with the Santa Fe Bank's name, third drawer, east side of the study. She had it folded in her coat in 4 minutes. She was at the kitchen door in 6. Cole Daggett was in the kitchen. He had come in from the back, she did not know how, because Pete was supposed to be watching, and he was standing between her and the door with his arms crossed and his flat, pleasant expression in place, and he said, "I had a feeling you would be back." She kept her voice steady through an act of will. "I came to collect some personal items I left behind," she said. "Sure," he said. He did not move. "What is in your coat?" "My handkerchief," she said. "Let me see it." She looked at him and calculated every angle simultaneously. He was larger than her and blocking the door, but she had a clear line to the study and beyond it, the front of the house, and Pete was somewhere on the property, and it was broad morning. He was not going to do something that could be witnessed. "No," she said simply, and walked directly toward him and the door, not stopping, maintaining velocity. He reached for her arm. She twisted before he could get a grip, the way her father had taught her when she was small, because her father had understood that the world was what it was, and she made it to the back door and out into the yard at a near run. Pete was coming around the side of the house and saw her face and said, "Mrs. Hart." "Get Andrew Ralston," she said without stopping. "Now." She did not stop running until she hit the eastern fence line, and Andrew was already coming from the other direction on horseback, which meant Pete had found a way to get word to him, or Andrew had been watching from closer than he had let on. He pulled up the horse and looked at her slightly out of breath, coat clutched to her chest, standing at the fence like she had planted herself there and dared the world to move her, and something in his face shifted in a way she had not seen before and would spend a very long time remembering. He swung down from the horse. "Did he hurt you?" he said. "No," she said. "I have the letter." He looked at her for a moment more. "Alma, I have the letter," she said again. "It is everything your lawyer needs. Shall we go?" He reached out and put both hands on her shoulders, not urgently, not frantically, but with a deliberate, steady pressure that said, "I see you, you are here, this is real." "Yes," he said, "we will go." They sent the letter to Santa Fe that afternoon by telegraph summary, with the original to follow by stage. Andrew's lawyer had the full case assembled within the week. The Santa Fe court moved with what passed for alacrity in 1882, which meant another 3 weeks, but the outcome was what they had worked for. The notes on Webb's property were declared fraudulent, Graves's purchase attempt failed, and Cole Daggett left Redemption Creek with his 2 men on a Tuesday morning in September, which was when Alma stood at the window of the ranch house and watched the dust of their departure and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since May. The crisis was over. And with it, she realized the necessity that had made everything between her and Andrew so clear and so close. She would need to think about what came next. She had a decision to make about the Webb position, which she had not formally resigned and to which she could return. She had a decision to make about Dry Creek Ranch, where she had been for 6 weeks and where she had, without entirely noticing it happening, become part of the way things worked. She had a decision to make about Andrew Ralston, which was really the whole of it. The Webb position and the ranch and everything else were just the context for the real question, which was what she was going to do with a love she had been not telling anyone for 3 months. She made none of these decisions immediately, because immediately she had to deal with the aftermath. Webb to inform, Jim to brief, Hector to reassure about the household rhythm going forward, the accounts to bring fully current. She threw herself into work as she always did when she needed to think, which was not exactly thinking but was the closest she could reliably get. Andrew gave her room. He was busy with the ranch, with the follow-up on the legal case, with getting back to the work of the breeding program that had fallen behind during the summer. But he was there, always just present enough that she never felt truly alone in what she was processing, which was a very fine line to walk, and he walked it without appearing to try. It was one evening in late September that the balance shifted. They were on the porch as usual, the night air beginning to have the edge of autumn in it, the canyon rim luminous under a half-moon. They had been talking about something ordinary, the horse fair in Albuquerque in November, whether the quarter-horse colt Andrew was most proud of was ready to show, and the conversation had gentled into one of their silences, which this time felt different, had a charge in it that she recognized and had been carefully managing for months. Andrew said, in the middle of the silence, "I have been thinking about what you said, about wanting things for yourself." She went still. "I have been thinking about it because I find that I have a want that I am not sure what to do with," he said, "which is unusual for me." She looked at his profile against the dark canyon. "I have been trying to work out," he continued, with the careful deliberateness of someone saying something they have rehearsed not because it is not genuine but because it matters too much to get wrong, whether it would be more fair to tell you or to let you leave in peace. "Tell me what," she said. He turned to look at her. "That you have made everything here different, that I do not want to imagine going back to the way this was before you. That I have been conducting this conversation in my head for 2 months and it sounds more rational in there." She held very still. "It sounds rational enough out here," she said. "I am not going to pretend I know exactly what I am offering," he said. "I know what I want it to be. I know that I pause, his eyes holding hers with the complete steadiness that was so specifically him. "Alma, you should know that I want you to stay." The want itself was the thing. He did not dress it up. He did not offer her a practical arrangement or a reasonable proposal or any of the armored versions of feeling she had encountered from other men. He said he wanted her to stay, which was the most naked thing he had ever said to her, and it cost him something visible. She said, "I have been in love with you since at least June." The stillness that came over him was the kind that precedes something being released. He reached over and took her hand, which he had not done before, and held it with both of his, and she felt something in her chest that she did not have a name for, that she suspected was the feeling of not having to be alone in the way she had been alone since she was 13 years old. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "We both should have," she said. "We are remarkably well matched in our disinclination to say the necessary thing." He made the sound that was almost a laugh, and then he did laugh, and it was so unlike him and so entirely right that she found herself laughing too, there on the porch of Dry Creek Ranch in the last good warmth of September, with the moon over the canyon wall and the horses moving quietly in the paddock, and it felt like the most natural thing she had experienced in longer than she could count. He asked her to marry him 6 weeks later. He did it in the kitchen garden of all places in early November, where she was taking up the last of the season's vegetables, and he had come to find her and stood for a long moment watching her work and then said, "I would like to formalize what I meant on the porch in September if you are willing." She turned from the garden. "Formalize it how?" "Marry me," he said. "If you want to, I want to, very much." She looked at him for a moment with the particular intensity of someone seeing something they have been hoping to see confirmed. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he repeated, and the word on his mouth had warmth in it, as though it was the best word he had encountered in years. They were married in December of 1882, in the Redemption Creek Methodist Church, with the bell that someone rang enthusiastically by hand for entirely too long, with Dolores Fuentes standing beside Alma and Jim Calloway beside Andrew, and nearly the entire population of Redemption Creek in attendance, because Dolores had organized it with her characteristic thoroughness, and made it very clear to everyone within a 20-mile radius that their presence was expected. Even Horace Webb came, looking slightly bewildered about how everything had turned out but decent enough to say he wished them well. There was a wedding supper at the ranch, and it ran very late, and by the time the last of the guests went home the fire was low, and the lamps were burning warm, and the night outside was winter cold and extraordinary with stars. Alma stood at the window of the room that was now definitively theirs, and looked at the sky for a moment before she felt Andrew come to stand behind her. He put his hands on her shoulders and she felt the warmth of him at her back, and the silence was one of the good ones, the kind that is not empty but full. "Are you happy?" he said. She turned to face him. "I have been many things in my life," she said. "Happy is not always one I could reliably locate, but right now, yes, completely." His hands moved up to her face and he kissed her with the particular quality he brought to everything that mattered, not rushed, not performative, entirely present. She kissed him back and put her hands against his chest and felt his heart under her palms, and thought that here was a person she could stand beside and be exactly herself, which was the thing she had not known she was looking for until she found it. Their first winter together was the happiest season Alma Hart had experienced as an adult, and she collected the happiness carefully, the way you collect something that has been scarce, knowing it and not taking it for granted. She settled into Dry Creek Ranch as if it had been waiting for her shape. She ran the household accounts with the precision she brought to everything, organized the supply chains that had been slightly haphazard under Jim's management of them, developed a correspondence with a supplier in Albuquerque who could deliver specialty items that had previously required a trip to Santa Fe, and found time, in the late afternoons, to do something she had not done since childhood: read for pleasure. Andrew had a collection of books that surprised her with its breadth, and they developed a habit of reading in the evenings in comfortable, companionable silence, which she found more deeply domestic and contented than anything she had previously associated with marriage. She learned more of him in those months. She learned that he woke before dawn every day not out of obligation, but because he genuinely loved the early morning, the quiet before everything began, the particular light on the canyon walls when the sun came over them. She learned that he was patient with animals to an extent that was almost philosophical, a patience that came from genuine respect for their nature rather than any desire to dominate it, which was why the horses responded to him the way they did. She learned that he had a dry, quiet humor that emerged most reliably when he was at ease, and that he was at ease with her in a way Jim told her, in a moment of complete frankness, that Jim had not seen him be at ease with anyone in a long time. "He had a very solitary years before you," Jim said, over a supply inventory in the barn one January morning. "After his father died, and then there was a woman in Santa Fe a few years back that ended badly. He does not speak of it. But you could see the shape of it in how closed off he was." Alma filed this information carefully. She asked Andrew about it directly that evening, which was how she did things, not circling, not approaching from the side. He looked at her over the top of his book and said, "Jim talks too much." "Jim talks exactly the right amount," she said. "Tell me." A pause. Then he put the book down. He told her about Alina, who had been in Santa Fe, who had wanted a life that was not this life, who had been honest about that and left before things went further, and who had been the last person he had let close enough to feel like a loss. It had not been dramatic, he said. It had been clear, and it had been clean, and it had been quiet and final, and he had come back to the ranch and put his head down and worked for 2 years and not particularly looked up again until a wagon ride on a cold March morning. "I want to be clear about something," Alma said. "Go ahead." "I am not going to need to leave for a different life," she said. "This is the life I would choose, not because I have no alternatives, but because I prefer this. I want you to know that if you are carrying any anxiety about the contrary." He looked at her with the full, steady attention he brought to the things that mattered most. "I know that," he said. "I am glad," she said. But it seemed worth saying. "It was," he agreed. "Thank you." She crossed the room and sat beside him on the settle, and he put his arm around her with the ease of someone for whom this had become entirely natural, and she thought again, as she often did, about how improbable all of this was, and how grateful she was for the improbability. Spring came, and with it the news that Alma was pregnant. She told Andrew on a morning in March, exactly a year, almost to the day, from when she had stepped off the stage in Redemption Creek, in the kitchen, over coffee, with the sun just coming over the canyon rim and turning the world gold. He was still for a moment, and then his face did something she had only seen it do a handful of times, opened completely. All the careful economy dissolved, and what was underneath was so unguarded and so glad that she had to blink. "Truly," he said. "As close to truly as I can determine," she said. "I am going to see the doctor in town to confirm it, but I believe so." He stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and knelt down so they were at eye level, which was not something he did ever, and held both her hands and looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. He did not need to. She could see everything in his face that he was not saying, and it was more than sufficient. "Are you frightened?" he asked finally. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "A great deal, in the best possible way." She laughed and he held her hands tighter, and then she pulled one free and put her palm against his jaw, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm in a gesture that was so tender it was almost unbearable. Dr. Marsh confirmed the pregnancy in mid-March. Dolores, upon being told, immediately became the organizing force she always became around significant events, and appeared at the ranch 3 days later with a collection of items she deemed essential, and a great deal of very specific advice that she delivered with complete authority and absolute affection. Andrew spent most of the spring either working the ranch with a kind of focused energy that was his version of excitement, or sitting beside Alma in the evenings with his hand resting lightly at her back, as if he needed to know she was there and real. He was not a worrier by nature, but she could see him keeping track of her, not intrusively, not to the point of hovering, but with a steady awareness that was its own kind of devotion. She loved him so much it sometimes caught her off guard, even now. The love had not diminished with familiarity. It had deepened, which was what she had always hoped love did when it was real, but had never been fully confident it would. The baby came in the early morning of November 3rd, 1883, with Dr. Marsh present and Dolores holding Alma's hand with a grip of iron, and Andrew on the other side doing the same, having refused absolutely to be removed from the room because, as he put it very quietly to Dr. Marsh when asked, "She is my wife, and I will be where she needs me." It was a boy. A healthy, furiously vocal boy who arrived at 4 in the morning and announced his presence to the entire ranch with immediate conviction. Andrew held his son with the same stillness he brought to everything, except that his eyes were completely bright, and he stood at the window with the baby in the growing dawn light, and Alma watched him from the bed and thought that this was one of the exact things she would carry with her for the rest of her life. This image, this morning, the light on his face and the small weight in his arms and the expression of someone who has been given something beyond their anticipation. "What shall we name him?" she said. He turned from the window. "I had been thinking Thomas," he said, "after your father if you would like." She had told him her father's name months ago in a conversation about her childhood, and he had remembered and held it. She pressed her lips together against the feeling that rose in her chest. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, Thomas Ralston." "Thomas Hart Ralston," Andrew said. "He should have both." She looked at him across the room, this man who had not been in her plans and had become the axis of her life. "Come here," she said. He came and sat carefully on the edge of the bed and held the baby between them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the three of them were there in the November morning quiet, and it was the most complete thing Alma Hart had ever been part of. Thomas grew into an energetic and observant child who had his father's eyes and his mother's precision, a combination that Andrew said, with quiet pride, was going to be both magnificent and extremely challenging. He crawled at 8 months and walked determinedly at 11, navigating the ranch with increasing confidence and an absolute conviction that the horse paddock was his personal domain, which Andrew began to encourage with great patience and Alma monitored with careful attention to actual safety. The horse breeding program flourished in the years that followed. The colt Andrew had been preparing for the Albuquerque Fair in 1882, delayed by everything with Daggett, finally showed in 1884 and won his class, which brought inquiries from 3 buyers and led to the first of several successful sales that would, over the following years, build the breeding operation into something genuinely significant in the regional market. Andrew developed a partnership with a buyer in El Paso, which led to him making the trip back to Texas he had not made in years, and he came back from El Paso with his sister Margaret, who had decided that she was tired of El Paso and that her brother's ranch sounded considerably more interesting. Margaret Ralston was 25, sharp, funny, and slightly reckless in a way that made Alma's measured instincts both useful and sometimes insufficient, because Margaret approached the world with a directness that outstripped even Alma's own. They liked each other immediately and completely, which Andrew observed with the expression of someone who had hoped this would happen and was relieved it had. Margaret settled at the ranch and proved genuinely useful with the horses, which was a passion she and Andrew shared, and she and Alma developed a friendship that was entirely its own thing, built on frankness and mutual respect, and the particular ease of 2 women who do not need to perform anything for each other. He was insufferable when he was younger, Margaret told Alma, 2 weeks after arriving, over the kitchen table with coffee. Absolutely convinced he knew exactly how everything should go, Father used to say Andrew was born with an agenda. He still has an agenda, Alma said. He has just learned to hold it loosely, Margaret grinned. That is you. Partially, Alma said. Though I think he was already working toward it. He is good, Margaret said simply. He has always been good. He just sometimes needed reminding that other people's paths were also valid. Alma thought about March of 1882, a wagon ride, 8 miles of road, 4 sentences. Yes, she said, he has gotten better at that. It was the summer of 1885 when news came that Morton Graves, the Santa Fe land speculator whose scheme had started everything, had been convicted of fraud in a broader case that went well beyond Redemption Creek, involving properties across 3 territories. The case had been building for 2 years and the verdict came down in July, and Andrew read the Telegraph notice with the kind of quiet satisfaction that does not require comment. He showed it to Alma and she read it and set it down and said, "Good, good," he agreed. "The Webb Ranch." Webb bought out the remaining notes himself finally. He is fine. He paused. He asked about you actually, whether you were well. That is kind of him, she said. I told him you were flourishing, Andrew said, and the word on his lips was warm and specific, not diplomatic. He seemed glad. She was flourishing. That was the right word for it. The Alma Hart who had stepped off a stage in Redemption Creek in March of 1882 with $3.40 and a letter to a difficult employer, had been a person of considerable capability and very little safety, managing everything competently from behind walls she had spent years building, because the walls had been necessary. The Alma Hart of 1885 was the same person, same capability, same precision, same refusal to be imprecise about what mattered, but the walls were gone, or not gone exactly but transformed, no longer barriers against the world but structure she had chosen, built of different material, serving a different purpose. She had a husband who saw her completely and loved what he saw without requiring it to be different. She had a son who at 2 years old could already be found every morning at the paddock fence, watching the horses with his father's expression. She had a home that was hers not by accident but by choice, chosen and rechosen every day. She had Dolers and Margaret and Jim and Hector and the whole of Redemption Creek, which had become in 3 years the deepest community she had ever belonged to. She had, as it turned out, The life she had not known she was looking for when she had been just functional enough to keep herself alive and moving forward. The summer of 1885 also brought a second pregnancy, which Alma discovered in August with a satisfaction that was calmer and deeper than the first announcement's excitement. The difference, she supposed, between hope confirmed and hope expanded. She told Andrew in the garden in the evening, while Thomas was asleep and the sun was going down and the canyon wall to the east was lit in the particular dark gold of late summer. He looked at her with the smile she had first seen at the fence line nearly 3 years ago, the rare one that involved his eyes. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. He pulled her into his arms right there in the kitchen garden, which was unlike him and entirely wonderful, and held her with his chin against the top of her head and said something too quiet to fully hear, which she suspected was meant for the evening air and not particularly for her. The kind of thing a private man says when gratitude exceeds what conversation can hold. "What did you say?" she asked. A pause. "I said that I am grateful," he said, "for the sequence of events that required you to change stages in Redemption Creek." She laughed against his chest. "A broken wheel fitting," she said, "the foundation of everything." "Dolores told me recently," he said, "that she knew from the moment she saw you that you were going to matter here. She said she told you about Webb's difficult reputation deliberately to see what you would do." Alma pulled back to look at him. "She what?" "She did not think you would run," Andrew said. "She was testing the quality of your determination." Alma thought about Dolores Fuentes and her absolute frankness and her enormous heart and her complete conviction that she knew what was good for the people she cared about, which was everyone. "I am going to have a very interesting conversation with her," she said. "She will be extremely unrepentant," Andrew said. "I know," Alma said. "That is why I am looking forward to it." Their second child, born in late April of 1886, was a daughter. They named her Clara, which was Margaret's middle name, and the name of a woman from Andrew's childhood in Texas, whom he described only as someone who had been very kind to him at a time when kindness was not plentiful, and which Alma thought was the right reason to name anyone anything. Clara arrived as loudly as Thomas had, and was, from the first week, a person of very distinct opinions, which she expressed with complete conviction despite having no words yet for them. Thomas regarded her with the solemnity of a 2-year-old confronted with something that had entered his domain, and then, within 3 days, decided she was his and began guarding the cradle with proprietary firmness. Andrew observed this and said to Alma very quietly, "He is going to be catastrophically protective of her." "He has good models," Alma said. The remark landed in him visibly, which she had intended. He looked at her the way he did when she said something that cut through all the layers to the real thing, and she held his gaze with the simple honesty she had been learning to sustain, and he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with everything he felt present in his face. "You know," he said, "there was a moment that evening in the saloon when Daggett was there, and you said those things to me. I thought if something had happened to you because I had not been more open, I would not have forgiven myself." This was the most that had been said between them about that night. It had been the night of the admission, the night everything finally broke open into what it had been for months, and they had both held it carefully since, the way you hold something that is still settling into its true shape. "Nothing happened to me," she said. "No, but I understood something that night, about what it means to have someone matter to you at a level that exceeds your plans for your own life." He was quiet for a moment. "My plans before you were extremely orderly, very specific. The ranch, the horses, the legal situation, a quiet life. You were not in them." She looked at him steadily. "I know. I am grateful every day," he said, "that plans change." She went to him and put both hands against his chest, and he wrapped both arms around her. And they stood like that in the evening light of their home, with Thomas's voice audible from somewhere outside and Clara sleeping a room away, and the horses moving in the paddock and the canyon wall turning golden to the east. And Alma Hart, who had arrived in Redemption Creek with $3.40 and a letter and a stubborn refusal to be anything less than fully alive. Thought that this was the best possible use of an unexpected life. The years that followed layered themselves one on another like the rock strata in the canyon walls east of the ranch, each one distinct, each one building on what came before, all of them together comprising something that had endured because it had been built with the right materials. Thomas at 5 was enrolled in the Redemption Creek School, where he distinguished himself by asking more questions than most teachers were prepared to field, and by maintaining an absolute authority over the other children's behavior regarding the school's one horse, which he considered to be under his personal protection. His teacher, a young woman from Albuquerque named Miss Perkins, reported to Alma at the end of his first term that Thomas was exceptional and also somewhat exhausting, and she said it in a tone that made clear both things were compliments. Clara at 3 was exactly the person she had promised to be from the first week: fierce, loving, certain, and impossible to distract once she had decided on something. She attached herself to Margaret with a devotion that Margaret returned completely, the two of them forming an alliance that the rest of the household observed with a mixture of affection and wariness. Because when they were in agreement about something they wanted, the combined force of their determination was formidable. Dry Creek Ranch in the late 1880s became what Andrew had always envisioned and been unwilling to claim the vision of aloud: a genuinely significant operation, respected across the territory, known for the quality of its horses and the reliability of its operation. Andrew's reputation, which had always been for fairness and competence, expanded to include something warmer: the reputation of a man who ran a good place in both the practical and the human sense. Alma was known, too, in her own right, as Dolers had told her she needed to be from the first. She had become something of an institutional presence in Redemption Creek, organizing the school supply fund when it fell short, helping Dolers manage the community assistance arrangements that existed informally to support families who fell on hard times, serving as an unofficial mediator in several property disputes, because her precision with records and her fairness in argument were both well established. She was asked twice in the late 1880s to serve on formal committees organizing the county's response to drought conditions, which she did efficiently and without requiring recognition for it. She and Dolers remained close through all of it. They had the kind of friendship that does not require constant maintenance, because it is built on fundamental compatibility of character. Two women who were direct, capable, warm under the efficiency, and deeply amused by the particular absurdities that frontier life generated with reliable consistency. On an October evening in 1889, Andrew and Alma sat on the porch as they had on countless October evenings, the night cool and carrying wood smoke from somewhere south, the canyon wall luminous under a nearly full moon. Thomas was 7 and asleep. Clara was 5 and also, theoretically, asleep, though the sounds from her room suggested this was aspirational. Margaret had taken herself into town to a social event with the cheerful self-determination that characterized everything she did. Andrew and Alma had been sitting in companionable silence for a comfortable stretch when he said, out of an easy quiet, "I have been thinking." "About what?" she said. "About what I would have told myself in 1881, if I could have." She looked at his profile, the particular angle of it, so familiar and still so completely itself. "What would you have said?" He thought for a moment. "That the plans are the least important part," he said. "That what matters comes sideways and asks if you need a ride and then reorganizes everything you thought you understood about your own life." She smiled. "You could have simply said that you would have told yourself to be less rigid about the agenda." "I could have," he agreed, "but that would not have been complete." She looked out at the dark canyon wall. "Andrew, yes. I would have told myself to stop being so thorough about protecting against loss that I forgot to be available for what I actually wanted." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was open in the way she had come to love the most, The face he had without the management, just the man himself, all the careful economy gone. "And what did you actually want?" he said. She looked back at him with the fullness of 7 years of knowing exactly what she wanted and having it, completely and without reservation. "This," she said. "All of it. You." He reached over and took her hand, as he had on an evening in 1882 that had changed the direction of everything, and held it with both of his. And the canyon was quiet, and the stars were out, and somewhere in the house Clara was decidedly not asleep, and Thomas was deeply in the way only the young can be, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the land extended in every direction for miles. Andrew Ralston, who had planned everything in his life before March of 1882 with disciplined specificity, and Alma Hart, who had arrived in Redemption Creek with almost nothing, and had built something that exceeded every possible version of what she had imagined, sat together on the porch of Dry Creek Ranch in the October dark, and there was not a single thing between them that had not been said or was waiting to be said. And the silence that surrounded them was the best kind, the kind made of everything that has been lived and known and chosen, and is still, every single day, being chosen again. In 1890, they added 2 rooms to the ranch house. Thomas needed his own space, and there was a 3rd child coming, discovered in February, which Alma announced at breakfast in the direct way she announced everything important, and which Andrew received with the smile that went to his eyes, the rare one, the good one, the one she had been collecting since their first winter. The new baby arrived in September of 1890, another boy, whom they named James after Jim Calloway, who had been with Andrew since the beginning, and who, upon being informed of the naming decision, went extremely quiet, and then said simply that it was the greatest honor of his life, which made Andrew grip his hand briefly, and Alma press her lips together against a feeling that was not going to survive a full breath intact. Young James from his earliest weeks had a quality that was both his parents' and neither of them. A particular stillness combined with an intensity of focus that Jim Calloway, his namesake, observed at 6 months old and said, "That one is going to know his own mind," which turned out to be extremely accurate. Dolores Fuentes, who had looked at a woman in her store in March of 1882 and decided she was worth knowing, stood as godmother for all 3 children, which she managed with the same practical devotion she brought to everything. She and Alma met every Thursday for coffee whenever the schedule allowed, and these meetings had become over the years a kind of running chronicle of Redemption Creek. What was happening, who needed help, what the community was building or trying to save or figuring out how to sustain. In one of these Thursdays in the autumn of 1890, Dolores said, "Do you ever think about where you would have been if the stage wheel had not broken here?" Alma considered this honestly. "Webb would have found another housekeeper eventually," she said. "I would have found another position. I would have been fine probably. But—" Alma looked at the window of the general store, the same window she had walked past 8 years ago with nothing and a determination to manage. "But fine is not what this is," she said. "What this is, I did not know was possible before I had it. I did not know how to plan for it because I did not have a category for it yet." Dolores nodded once with the expression of someone whose instincts have been confirmed. "That is what I thought," she said, "when I saw you. That you were someone who needed to find something she did not yet know she was looking for." "You are insufferably perceptive," Alma said. "I know," said Dolores with complete satisfaction. Andrew, when Alma told him this conversation, said, "She is also the reason the bell gets rung too long at every event. She organizes the children to do it." "That explains a great deal," Alma said. They laughed about it together. There in the ranch house kitchen in the early evening with the lamp throwing warm light and James asleep in the next room, and Thomas reading somewhere with the focused silence of a child who has discovered books, and Clara arguing with Margaret about something in the yard that Alma and Andrew both chose, by mutual wordless agreement, not to investigate. It was an ordinary evening. It was everything. Thomas Ralston, at 8 years old, could work the paddock fence with the horses with a competence that impressed even the experienced hands, who said to Andrew that the boy had the natural ease with animals that could not be taught. Andrew watched his son work with the expression Alma had come to read as pride too deep for easy expression, which was the deepest kind. Clara Ralston, at 6, had decided she was going to learn to read 3 years ahead of her school grade, and was advancing on this goal with a systematic ferocity that delighted Alma and made Andrew say, privately, that he recognized the approach, and it was extremely effective and slightly alarming even now. James Ralston, at less than 1 year old, was already, as Jim had predicted, a person of total self-determination, who slept when he decided to sleep and was awake when he decided not to be, and looked at the world with a focused assessment that Alma recognized as the thing she had first seen in Andrew Ralston on a cold March morning in a wagon 8 years and a whole life ago. Andrew Ralston, at 41, was the same man he had been at 31 in all the ways that mattered and different in all the ways that love and time and the willingness to be known make people different. Still precise, still direct, still capable of going very quiet and very still when something required the full weight of his attention, but open in a way he had not been, available to joy in a way the rigid planning of his earlier years had not allowed. Soft in the middle of the capable exterior, in a way that only the people who had been let inside the walls could see. Alma Hart Ralston, at 34, was, as Andrew had told the telegraph operator in Redemption Creek when sending a birth announcement for James, and the man had inquired how she was doing, flourishing. She had the word now, fully, in all its dimensions, not just the surface of competence and management which had always been there, but the full depth of someone who had arrived at the life she wanted and was living it with both hands, with her whole self, with the gratitude of someone who knows what it means to have been without and can measure exactly the distance from there to here. The ranch was theirs in the fullest sense. The land and the horses and the accounts and the kitchen garden and the porch where they sat in the evenings, and the room where they slept, and the table where they ate, and the life that had been built in this high desert country under the enormous New Mexico sky, with the canyon wall turning every color in every kind of light, with the community of Redemption Creek around them and the friends who had become family and the children who were becoming themselves. On a morning in November of 1890, not long before Thomas's 8th birthday, Alma stood at the kitchen window with coffee and looked out at the paddock where Andrew was with Thomas, the two of them working with the young horses in the early light, and she thought about a particular sentence, a sentence spoken in a saloon on an autumn night in 1882, in front of every man in Redemption Creek, while Cole Daggett was on the floor and the world was waiting. "You are not in my plans for this life. And I am grateful everyday plans change." She had known, the moment he said it, that it was the truest thing she had ever heard anyone say about her. She had known it the way you know things that arrive not as conclusions but as recognitions, something you have been reaching for without knowing it, and then your hand closes around it, and you understand, simply and completely, that this is the thing you were always going to find. Andrew looked up from the paddock at that moment, the way he sometimes did, with the attentiveness that had always been specific to her. He saw her at the window and did not wave or gesture, but simply looked, the full, steady look of someone who sees what they are looking at without any gap between the looking and the seeing. She raised her coffee cup in a small acknowledgement. He did the same thing he had done on that first wagon ride in March of 1882, nodded once. But it meant something different now. It meant everything they had built, and everything they were, and every day that had accumulated between the cold spring morning of the beginning and this warm November of the full life. She turned from the window to the kitchen where Clara had appeared, 6 years old and fully awake and already certain about something she intended to pursue. And James was making himself heard from the next room with convictions of his own. And the day was beginning with the wholeness and the noise and the particular grace of a life that had not been planned and was, for that precise reason, exactly right. She put her coffee cup down and went to meet the morning.